Hey everyone, it's Wit. I'll be doing the topic analysis for the November-December topic on the public's right to know versus candidates' right to privacy. Um, I'll be covering the neg-util topic analysis, which will go over a broad range of things. Important to note, I will be honest, this is a hard topic to approach when prepping the negative from a utilitarian standpoint. This stems from a few things. First, the topic wording is very vague. Um, the scope of what Affs that would be covered under it is not only ambiguous, but it's also potentially large and unpredictable. There's, a pretty wide range of policies that theoretically could place a candidate's right to privacy behind a right to know. Potentially any AF that really gives a private piece of a candidate's uh, information to the public and requires them to do so would probably be considered topical, which means there's a pretty wide range of potential AFs. Additionally, it's hard to find generics on this topic since they that will apply to every AF just because the scope of it is so large. There's not really many generics that even apply to both tax returns and medical records, which means it can be a little hard to approach knowing what to make case negs for before the first few tournaments where it's found out what people are actually running. This means it's important to prioritize finding generics and things that will apply to the widest ranges of AFs, especially for the first tournament. Even if there's a hypothetical AF you're really scared of, uh, if you don't think it'll be run that much, you should probably prioritize focusing on prep that will apply to everything, given there will be AFs broken that you just don't have responses to. However, this doesn't mean it's impossible to be neg and run util positions. The scope of affirmatives, I think that people will be running at the first few tournaments will definitely be predominantly a subset of AFs uh, that have a wide range of literature. Additionally, given the nature of the topic, AF offense will be limited if they're reading util positions. Elections happen probably about once every 4 years, at least for major ones. House elections are 2 years, Senate elections are 6 years, and then it varies on the state level. But essentially, what this means is whatever the affirmative tries to make candidates disclose or give to the public won't happen very often. It's likely they won't have to give it very often or won't be relevant. For example, tax returns, the vast majority of candidates do give it to them, but the impacts will also likely be pretty speculative. It'll rely on, a candidate who does not release their tax returns, who would now release their tax returns under the bill, and that them releasing their tax returns would make a meaningful difference. When it just likely is very hard to predict that sort of thing about elections, uh, especially constructing an impact scenario about it. So by building neg generics that will apply no matter who the AF is talking about, I predict a large number of AFs will talk about Trump, and being able to respond to them is useful, and you'll be able to, have supercharge these generics by the fact that AF offense is just will likely be pretty tenuous. Um, so what the structure of this will be, given the lack of many wide-ranging generics, is I'm going to cover a few of what I think will likely be the most predominant AFs, and cover responding to them. Uh, Probably the three I predict will be most common are A, tax returns. This is likely considering our current president, Trump, broke a pretty long ranging norm of major parties' candidates not releasing tax returns and finance information, given uh, the vast number of scandals regarding his finances, his campaign's financing, and that sort of thing. People likely capitalize on that, and the wide number of articles written in the context of the 2016 election about why having candidates' tax returns public is important in order to gain some sort of political, uh, international relations esque advantage. Health records is something that's been discussed for a very long time. This is because candidates tend to be older due to them requiring a lot of experience, um, which means they could be more prone to health risk, which can damage their ability to govern. There's a history of presidents hiding health conditions while in office. If you research it, you can look into people like FDR, Ronald Reagan, who did or potentially had health complications or details about their health complications that were not fully exposed to the public. And those can certainly influence governing. And so there's a wide range of law and political science scholars who talk about why or why not candidates should have to make their health records public. The last one, which I'm more skeptical about as a viable AF, but I think people will be running it, is campaign finance. Uh, in terms of things like super PACs, Citizens United, and campaign financing, having to make it public who candidates are taking money from, who's financing their elections, and that sort of thing, is certainly very relevant. And people will be able to construct impacts surrounding that. So to start off with tax returns. Additionally, these you'll probably notice there aren't many big stick impact scenarios I'll be talking about. This is because I think the core debates on most of these affirmatives is hard to construct an impact scenario for that terminates in like extinction. I think it'll be hard for the affirmatives to do. And additionally, the vast majority of these debates go on in ways that aren't necessarily about giant magnitude, but rather the pragmatics of things. And so, given those debates' representation in literature, I'll be mostly focusing on those. So, to start off with tax returns, I think when approaching these affirmatives, there's a few important arguments I think negs should make. The first one is that tax returns don't really do anything useful. Even though it's a norm for candidates to release them, the people releasing tax returns debatably, does not really produce any meaningful information for people to use. Essentially, if I think it's called a Form 1044, which is what most people release, it's essentially a very brief listing of like how much income they made, how much income they made on investments, how much they donated to charity, how much they take of other deductions, and then it results in a number, which is how much their federal income tax was. That's essentially it. It doesn't, uh, some tax returns do show it. Most candidates release this. It doesn't show where their money came from. It maybe shows what their main employer was. It doesn't show what they're invested in, how they bought like their house 30 years ago, all those sorts of things. So essentially, it tells you what tax rate the candidate paid and if they made a lot of money or a little. From this, it's hard to. The negative can make a case for why there's not really a reason for why having these tax returns public makes any meaningful difference in terms of whether people vote for a candidate or whether they should or whether someone is fit for office. What people, a number of legal scholars I've read just talk about how essentially this call for like making tax returns mandatory is just essentially because people sort of have like a desire to see how much people are making. But that doesn't really translate into whether people are able to govern effectively or that sort of thing. Which means it's less useful than it may seem. For example, everyone kind of assumes Trump probably did not pay much in taxes, at least relative to his wealth. He probably used tricks. He probably still would have won. Given the vast majority of his voters, the breaking point for whether they voted for him or not was not, oh, he paid a 13% income tax, not a 26% one. That just is less relevant to elections than it may seem. Additionally, there are substantial pragmatic difficulties with releasing tax returns. If they're in depth and go beyond just a number on a sheet, they can very easily, for example, if someone has a family business, let's say they're not the head of the Trump organization, but a family farmer, or some other type of business person, tax returns can certainly reveal insider information, things about, where their companies get their money from, who they're buying from. that can damage their company's ability to compete, and all those sorts of things. So it can sort of pose difficulties for candidates who release their tax returns, uh, certainly at a level at which it may reveal information about themselves that's useful to voters. It can also, discourage people from doing it because if they lose, they have just seriously shot themselves in the foot in terms of their ability to do well. Which means it can discourage qualified people from choosing to do so. It can mean people, if they become like, it can lead to people becoming harmed simply because they ran for president, state senator, city comptroller. People probably assume, just in general, all of these apps are about the president or high office, but there's tons of other offices people campaign for that are a much lower level. And many people run for these offices and actually make less than they were making before. So, given it can discourage, people from doing so, that may be bad. One author described them as just sort of a weapon for political combat. Certainly, were tax returns to be released, uh, people would attack others. If Trump's tax returns came out and they were 13%, or some other very low number for the amount of money he made, Clinton certainly would have attacked him. And were it a Democrat who paid very little and a Republican paying a lot, the Republican certainly would have attacked them. Uh, but the sort of problem with this political dynamic is that there's not necessarily something wrong about someone paying low taxes. For example, Trump's low taxes could easily be explained by certain details of the real estate tax code having to do with real estate value depreciation. All of those, he's legally allowed to take that exemption. In fact, it would be kind of ridiculous for him not to. Um, and the fact that people like Trump are able to pay very little in taxes, even compared to people making much less of them, is more of an indictment of the tax system than the candidate themselves. And it doesn't make much sense to attack someone for paying as little in taxes as they could, because pretty much anyone would take that opportunity. Uh, in terms of big stick disads, things like Lash Out GOP Revolt, um, a lot of states currently are trying to pass laws about forcing people to release their taxes to be on the ballot. Certainly, Republicans would view this as essentially Democratic states trying to make it impossible for Trump to even be president, uh, which would probably, were it to occur, and Trump wasn't on the ballot in certain places, uh, cause pretty big political issues. It may, A, cause Republicans to feel under attack and turn out in higher numbers. It could, lead to things like Trump lashing out at Democrats and leading to even worse problems. Additionally, authors talk about how, releasing Trump's tax returns may just cause him to resign. This may be a good or bad thing. Were he to resign because of some Democrat passed law, Republicans might, take it upon themselves to, get revenge by doing bad things, like repealing Roe v. Wade, uh, implementing a bunch of laws that may, damage a lot of progressive victories, which are important considerations. Additionally, there are constitutional issues which will be covered later, but especially in the context of tax returns, it's questionable whether a law that mandates candidates release tax returns is follows the Constitution and abides by precedent. In terms of counterplans, actors, states, and the federal government could pass such a law. States have currently been trying. For example, California passed a law and then it was vetoed by Jerry Brown because of political and legal considerations. But states certainly do have control over who's on ballots, which means they would have control over that. Additionally, federalism. Authors, though mainly from partisan websites, talk about how the federal government implementing such a law would be a flagrant violation of separation of powers, federalism, because states get to determine who's on the ballot, and the federal government passing that law would be bad, which could make that a DA. Additionally, there are loopholes where, for example, if the Democrats won the House, they would be, or there's certain committees within Congress that have the power to essentially release any tax returns. Uh, Obviously, it has not been exercised. Republicans have the majority in all those committees, but theoretically, they could just be released by Congress, and I could see process counterplans that say just they release them instead of passing such a law with net benefits like politics, base, etc. Process counterplans, like the ones mentioned above, can deal with constitutional issues, political issues, uh, pragmatic issues, all of those sorts of things. Uh, Next, health records. This is a second AF I think will be common. Again, you can look at, I believe Lucas is doing the AF util topic analysis, and all these AFs will likely be covered there. Health records, I think there's a number of arguments that should be made here. First, is that forcing candidates to release all of their health records causes a disproportionate focus on, like, unimportant things. For example, um, things like whether someone takes anti-anxiety medicine, whether someone has insomnia. Uh, those sorts of things may be minor uh, and unimportant to whether someone's able to, like, govern effectively. But things like, someone had a stroke 20 years ago that doesn't pose any risk to themselves. The public sort of does not have the medical knowledge to assess whether uh, certain medical conditions damage someone's ability to govern, and that sort of thing, which means relatively innocuous things that may be on medical records could disproportionately damage one candidate's ability to win, despite the fact that they don't need it, which is largely responsive to, I think, some AFs, which we'll talk about just releasing medical records writ large. It also discourages both candidates uh, and presidents and people who hold office from seeking medical assistance for health conditions. For example, if someone, has to go to a doctor for some condition, if they're trying to hide it, they may just choose not to go because that goes on their medical record. Uh, Especially for presidents who may be planning on running for re-election, we'd really rather, if someone is in a threatening situation, they see a doctor to prevent it from damaging their ability to govern. Uh, if they do that and then it gets published publicly, their private medical records, they may just choose not to do it or hide their conditions, which makes the public less knowledgeable, but also, link turns their arguments. Um, there are also medical ethics arguments, whether doctors are even allowed to, like, diagnose things insofar as they know that they're potentially being released to the public, which can violate things like HIPAA. All of these are relevant to debates because it's not so simple as just yes or no. Uh, I think counterplans are very important on this. There is probably some health information that is certainly relevant. If a president has Alzheimer's, for example, that can mean seriously damage their ability to execute their duties, and that might be something that's relevant. Counterplans can help mitigate these sorts of offense. Uh, Common things in the literature are things like the partial disclosure counterplan. Essentially, this would allow candidates to only have to disclose conditions that damage their ability to execute their duties. This can look like a few things. I think the primary one I've seen is essentially candidates will submit their health records to a panel of doctors, commonly like former surgeon generals, who will review the health records. Candidates can make a declaration that they don't have any conditions that are relevant to their ability to be president or senator or whatever. Um, and then, insofar as and then the doctors can, you know, declare them truthful. This means that things that aren't relevant but the public who don't know much about medicine might think are damaging don't disproportionately influence it, and only things the public needs to know would know. Uh, Signed affidavits would mean that presidents swear or candidates swear under the penalty of perjury that they don't have any conditions, or list the ones they do. If they're lying and it becomes found out, they'd be subject to criminal sanction. I think pics are also highly relevant. There's a lot of information medically about health of candidates that probably just should not be made public. For example, abortions. genetic information, which can be unuseful for determining whether someone's really likely to get it. For example, someone may contain an enzyme that makes them maybe 4% more likely to develop Alzheimer's, but they still have about a 2% chance. That does not really say much. It's still an extremely low chance, and the president, by all means, will probably likely be very successful in executing their duties, or at least not be hindered. But genetic information, people might misinterpret that. So genetic information, given its inability to sort of predict with certainty, picking out of those sorts of things. Additionally, things like STD status, things that can embarrass people but don't, aren't medically threatening to someone's life. All of those sorts of things picks are useful for. Constitutionality, I'll cover pretty quickly. There are two cases you should know. First is U.S. Term Limits Incorporated versus Thornton. This was a case about whether states are allowed to put term limits on Senate candidates. It was ruled that states cannot use their ballots to achieve preferred political or policy outcomes. States who wanted term limits to, prevent people from being in office too long were not allowed to do so, and was ruled unconstitutional because they essentially created conditions for public office, i.e. senators, that were not in the Constitution, which created new requirements, which was bad. Anderson versus Calabrese ruled it for presidential candidates, any ballot access requirements, common ones are like having to get signatures, must be narrowly tailored to achieving their neutral goal. For example, requirements that people have to get like 10,000 signatures to be on the ballot only exist to make sure that you don't have 1,000 people on the ballot. But things like tax returns, which are meant to most likely prevent people like Trump from being on the ballot or achieve a political goal, there's a pretty compelling argument for why those would be unconstitutional. That has a few implications. The obvious ones are constitutionality and court legitimacy disads. It would be overturning precedent. And weakening that precedent would likely have implications on other things. A notable one is voting rights. Anderson versus Calabrese is an important case because it's the basis for a lot of past voting rights decisions. It essentially, the basis, which is that for Anderson, was that ballot access requirements that aren't narrowly tailored hurt people's ability to vote for their preferred candidate. And so it's based in voters' rights. Ruling that weakening that precedent would weaken the ability to say voters have a right to vote for who they want to, which helps things like voter ID laws and other things, which is actually written about quite prevalently recently in the literature. Finally, campaign finance. I think this will also be a common Aff. I think the major issues with it, I don't think it's topical. I don't think the donors to a candidate's political committee are the same thing as a candidate's privacy. Additionally, candidates are required to disclose who all their donors are. So I'm not exactly sure what an Aff that required them to disclose their donors would do. Anonymous donors are required to donate to super PACs, which legally are unaffiliated with a candidate or campaign. A candidate and their campaign committee are not allowed to coordinate with super PACs. So if they cover those, they're definitely not talking about a candidate's right to privacy, considering it's not even a candidate's information who donated to them. If they don't, then people likely just move there if they want to donate with more secrecy. Either case, I'm not exactly sure how this Aff solves for its impact. Court legitimacy, it would probably require overturning Citizens United. Corporate personhood, which is also the basis for a lot of other things like tax code, corporate liability, and that sort of thing. So disads could be built off of that. There are also fun counterplans you can read against it. For example, a person named Lawrence Lessig, who's a professor, I believe, at the Harvard Law School, who's probably the biggest, if not one of the biggest, proponents of campaign finance reform, has a proposal about basically making all donations absolutely anonymous, so even a campaign doesn't know who donated to them through like a legal structure called blind trust, because then it would be hard for a candidate to essentially sell out and like reward someone who donated to them if they didn't know who donated to them. This would be mutually exclusive since it would not be public who donated to a candidate, and there are compelling arguments for why it may be even more effective. So this covers, I think, the three most common Affs I predict. The constitutionality stuff will likely apply to a vast majority of affirmatives that have to do with ballot access requirements, which I think will be one of the most common